Thank you for joining us this afternoon. You see represented before you today two organizations that we're here to observe Ukraine's parliamentary elections, the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. So today we're here to report our findings, make preliminary statements, and to take your questions. Our order will be as follows. Ms. Iveta Radičová will speak first, followed by Ambassador Victor Ashe. These are the two International Republican Institute delegation co-leaders, and they will be followed by Representative Karan English and Onyszkiewicz. So we will go in that order, IRI, NDI, and then collectively we will take your questions.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express congratulations to the citizens of Ukraine for the results of the elections. I'm sure that they are ready to restart Ukraine as a whole, to keep the peace and establish the peace, and more, that they are prepared to recover the trust of those citizens in Ukraine who have lost it. They have real such a chance after these elections, and we will look how they continue, and I hope that they will fulfill this positive chance. I'd like to say that the International Republican Institute observers visited more than 150 polling stations in Cherkasy, Chernihiv, Dmitropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Lviv, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Ternopil, Volyn, Zaporozhye, and Zhytomyr. We were impressed by patriotism, willingness of the people, but on another side we have seen the sad, we have seen the cry. So, new government and new parliament will face not easy task to promote really important and implement long-term reforms and to prepare Ukraine for normal, standard, stable existence. We can conclude that we have found only really minor, non-systematic irregularities and none that would affect the outcome of the elections. Some technical problems which were immediately solved by commissions. I would like to stress that it was really professionally prepared, and mainly the heads of commissions were really good organizers, managers, and gentlemen, if you do not mind, ladies, were really perfect managers. We can conclude that we have seen, in comparison with former years, improvement in the voter lists. Voters were able to easily receive a ballot and to understand the whole procedure. So it was a really transparent process, and I think that for pre-elections, parliamentary pre-elections, the turnout, 52.44%, is not only legal, but also legitimate result of elections. So, Ukraine is now facing really huge challenge to undertake the reforms. I think citizens shows they are demanding such reforms, and what we can see is really deep change in Ukraine, because the former in majority pro-Russian parliament is now in majority pro-Europe and pro-reform parliament. So I hope that not after a long time we then can say welcome Ukraine in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. It's a pleasure for me to join as the co-chair of the International Republican Institute delegation, and also our friends from the National Democratic Institute, led by Congresswoman English, to be here and to congratulate the people of Ukraine, who under the most arduous circumstances have once again demonstrated their commitment to democracy and their determination that this election go forward. It would be difficult to imagine a more bizarre situation than what the people of Ukraine faced, with one part of the country annexed into Russia, another part occupied by insurgents, and yet the election was held in basically 90% of the nation, including the liberated Ukrainian territory, which I'm glad to say the IRI delegation represented by Olin Weatherton was able to visit yesterday. As the Prime Minister pointed out, it was remarkably well held. This would be a good election in the United States. It would be a good election in any democratic country in the world. And I think what we saw, and several of us, Mrs. English and I, certainly have been candidates for office in our home communities, and the way in which, at least at the polling places I was at, it wasn't all that different than what would have happened in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I'll let her speak to Flagstaff, Arizona. But in terms of people having the right to vote, casting their vote, having the privacy of the ballot box, and knowing that their vote was counted the way it was cast. Certainly, the groundwork has been set with the new president of Ukraine, with the new Rada that has just been elected, to bring about the reforms that the people of Ukraine clearly have evidence that they desire. That will be up to the democratic process for the Rada and the president to make it happen, but certainly no one could say that the people elected were not freely elected and elected as part of a due process with a legitimate campaign, a legitimate debate on the issues, and a legitimate participation in that process by which all who wanted to vote could vote and did vote. It was a privilege for me. This is the fourth time personally that I've had the privilege of visiting Ukraine, and each time I come and I see progress under difficult circumstances, progress in the face of adversarial situations that most free democratic countries simply do not have to face, but which the Ukrainian people have faced. And this election, unlike ones in the past prior to 2014, I think was above reproach in terms of the way it was handled. And certainly the IR delegation feels comfortable in saying that the outcome reflects what the people of Ukraine wanted. And as a citizen who believes strongly in the democratic process, I look forward to seeing how that works itself out and how the people of Ukraine move forward, with the future being a bright one for them despite the dark clouds that exist brought on by foreign forces in certain parts of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, Ambassador Ashe, Prime Minister Radičová. Thank you all for joining us today. The National Democratic Institute's delegation included representatives from 10 countries. The delegation's co-leaders, Congresswoman English and Defense Minister Onyszkiewicz, symbolize the importance of a transatlantic commitment to a democratic Ukraine. Just briefly, other members of NDI's leadership group were Robin Carnahan, former Secretary of State of Missouri, Per Eklund, former Swedish ambassador and head of the European Union delegation to Georgia, Maciej Jorsi, former Hungarian Member of Parliament and leader of the ALDE group in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and Leah Hani, a former Member of Parliament of Estonia and former Minister of Property Reform. Copies of our full statement will be available at the close of the press conference. NDI has worked in Ukraine since 1992, and for these elections, we supported the monitoring efforts of Opora and also those of the European Network of Election Monitoring Organization, NMO. Finally, NDI is grateful to USAID, which funded the work of this mission, and also very much to the election administrators, government officials, political leaders, and civil society representatives who shared their time so generously with the delegation. Karen?
Thanks so much. This is my first visit to Ukraine, and I was so warmly and graciously accepted by all the folks that I met during my stay here, and I really appreciate the Ukrainian people. Ukraine's October 26 parliamentary elections marked a major achievement for a country facing fighting and foreign intervention. For the second time in less than 6 months, the Ukrainian people have conducted elections that meet international democratic standards in spite of the Russian occupation of Crimea and Russian-backed separatist conflicts in the East. The credibility of these elections will help the parliament advance Ukrainians' aspirations for democracy, independence, and sovereignty. The process involved some shortcomings, none of which appeared to undermine electoral credibility. The delegation was concerned about problems in the legal framework, sporadic incidents of violence, intimidation, and attempts to disrupt voting, some instances of voter bribery and smear campaigns in the media, insufficient promotion of women, and inadequate campaign finance regulations. Concerted efforts should be made to prevent recurrence of these problems in the future. While troubling, however, these issues were less pervasive than in the 2012 parliamentary elections, and they did not appear to be centrally orchestrated or directed against a particular political target. The delegation could not help but notice that women were doing the real work of administering the elections, particularly at the local levels. We were also impressed by the number of women who played a prominent role in their parties' campaigns and were placed high enough on the lists to be elected, which represents an improvement over the 2012 parliamentary elections. However, there is more progress to be made. We hope that gender equality will be one of the factors taken into account as the government is formed, as the new parliament takes up reform of the electoral system, and as all other political and economic reforms are pursued. Janusz?
I also would like to express my gratitude for inviting me to Ukraine once again. It was a great pleasure to be once again in Kiev and in Ukraine, especially for such an occasion as the elections. The elections brought certain results, brought a new parliament, which obviously together with president will face a very serious tasks, reforms of judicial system, creating fully independent judiciary, fighting corruption, economic reform, which could be painful but absolutely necessary. Clearly, the whole electoral process is not over yet. We still should wait for the outcome of the final tabulation works, for complaints which could be actually considered and sorted out. But nevertheless, everything looks that the final outcome would be extremely positive, as has been already mentioned. And that would create an extremely good base for forming a broad support for reforms, the reforms which government will have to actually carry out. And obviously what should be clear to our Ukrainian friends is that democracy is the rule of majority, but not a tyranny of majority. That means ruling the country, one must take into consideration, bring into this certain kind of understanding people who are not represented in the government, but who voted, who are the citizens of Ukraine. That's why the broad support for reforms would be absolutely necessary. And hopefully this broad support could be actually obtained. And among the reforms which are required, one I think also should be mentioned, and not as something of lesser importance, and this is the decentralization of the country. This is something extremely important, and this decentralization clearly will take a form of setting up local governments, and this will be a total political change in the country, which is absolutely necessary, but which will create a situation in which there will be sort of new element, new dimension in the whole process. These local elections and local governments would form local elites and will allow people to feel that the problems they have could be sorted out by themselves, and that will also somehow be very much in line of certain principle on which every country in the European Union is built, and that is the principle that the decisions should be taken at the very lowest level possible. This is so-called principle of subsidiarity. Ukraine aspiring to join European Union and hopefully being a member sometime in the future of European Union, if I may express my own view, I certainly will have to follow this path. And I think that, and we think in NDI, that the outcome of these elections somehow shows that Ukraine is on a good path. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janusz. Just to add to what you've heard today, you've heard that the elections were generally well administered. We see increasing level of professionalism at the Central Election Commission and the various bodies that administer elections in Ukraine. We see continued improvement in the National Voter Registry, in the voters list. In previous elections, that was not always the case. In fact, the last election that was held here, the presidential election, was really the first time in many years that the voters list was not an issue in terms of the reports of observation missions post-election. So we see progress in a number of areas administratively. One issue that surfaced during the campaign and was subject to discussion on Election Day was the use of the mixed system. And I know there's a lot of debate about the merits and the downsides of such a system. I know that the Ukrainian parliament, the new parliament, will face many challenges and will undertake very, very critical decisions regarding new legislation that it will adopt in its first year. But at some point in time, it is our hope that the Verkhovna Rada will take a serious look and will review the mixed system and will look at the election law. There's been discussion about possible codification of the presidential, parliamentary, and local election laws. And we support this idea, this notion. We would recommend that perhaps even public debates take place and possibly hearings in Parliament on the right type of election system for Ukraine and the issue of codification. But back to the original statements, I would concur. IRI and NDI both feel that many positive steps were made in election law and election administration with this election, and we urge the Ukrainian government to continue that progress. With that, Laura, if you have some comments, we'll be happy to hear from you now. If not, we'll go to questions. Okay. Great. We would ask that anyone who has questions to stand, identify the organization that you represent, and if you have a particular person that you would like to direct your question to respond to, please do so. Who has questions? Pytanie je. Nema?
No questions? Everything is clear. Yes, you have a question, please. Microphone, please. I'm sorry, we can't hear the question. Microphone should be used.
There were observers on the ground, and if I might pass the answer on to the person who is informed by those observers, I'd like to do that, but thank you for the question.
We have had people on the ground observing the situation. NDI has a permanent presence here in Ukraine, as does IRI. And from all accounts that we heard from our own observers, those of other international organizations, and particularly those of the Ukrainian citizen monitoring organizations, the Committee of Voters of Ukraine and Opora among them, the issue of abuse of administrative resources, which has been a huge concern in all previous elections, did not turn out to be a big issue. There were examples, I think, that were raised, but most observers said that they felt the abuses were at a much lower level than they had been in any previous election.
Other questions?
Thank you very much.